On a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Chicago, Sienna Ashcroft, CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation, walks out of the most dangerous board meeting of her life carrying a flash drive worth more than her own existence. 5 men are already waiting. They don't want money. They want silence. And they intend to get it. What happens in the next 30 seconds will be captured on camera, watched by millions, and change 2 lives forever, in ways neither of them could have predicted. If this story already has you hooked, drop a like and tell me in the comments. What city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind of cold, indifferent Chicago rain that didn't bother announcing itself. It just arrived and stayed, soaking through coats and pooling in the uneven asphalt of the Meridian Tower parking structure on West Adams Street. Sienna Ashcroft noticed the rain only because it was the reason she'd parked on level 2 instead of walking the 4 blocks to the lot she usually used. She'd been in a hurry when she arrived that morning. She was in a different kind of hurry now. The board meeting had run 2 hours longer than scheduled and ended without a vote, which meant it had also ended without resolution, and the resolution was the entire point. She stepped out of the elevator into the concrete stillness of level 2 with her bag over one shoulder and her phone in her hand, already pulling up the contact for her attorney. The flash drive was in the interior pocket of her blazer, zipped shut. She'd been carrying it for 6 days. The data on it, financial transfers, redacted contracts with restored metadata, a series of internal communications that had been deliberately purged from company servers 3 months ago, represented approximately 14 months of careful, quiet accumulation. She hadn't gone looking for it at first. She'd stumbled onto the first thread during a routine audit review and pulled it, the way you pull a loose hem, not expecting it to unravel anything significant. Then it had kept unraveling. What she'd found, piece by piece, was that Halcyon Group, her company, the company her father had built from a regional logistics firm into a nationally respected infrastructure corporation, had been used as a financial conduit for close to $1 billion in fraudulent municipal contracts across 6 states. The fraud went back 7 years. It predated her tenure as CEO, but it had continued under her watch, conducted by people who worked in her building, sat in her meetings, and smiled at her across conference tables. She hadn't told anyone inside the company. She didn't know who was clean. She was 40 feet from her car when she realized she wasn't alone. There were 5 of them. She registered that number first, then the spacing. 2 near her vehicle, 1 at the exit ramp, 2 moving to position behind her. It was deliberate arrangement, the kind that required coordination, and that realization sent a cold clarity through her that was separate from fear. Fear came a half-second later. Ms. Ashcroft. The man nearest her car spoke first. He was in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She recognized him. His name was Douglas Fenn, and until last Tuesday he'd been listed as a senior advisor to Halcyon's board of directors. "We were hoping to speak with you." "You could have scheduled a meeting," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This isn't that kind of conversation." She stopped walking. Running wasn't an option. The man at the exit ramp had positioned himself carefully. Her phone was in her hand and she moved her thumb toward the screen, and one of the men behind her said, "Put it away, please." The please was the most frightening part. It meant he was comfortable. It meant he didn't feel rushed. She lowered the phone but didn't put it in her pocket. Ben took a few steps toward her. In the flat fluorescent light of the garage, she could see that his expression wasn't angry. It was tired, almost apologetic, which was somehow worse. "We know what you have," he said. "We know you haven't shared it yet. That window can stay open." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sienna." He said her first name with a familiarity that made her stomach turn. "You've been carrying that drive for almost a week. You went to an attorney last Thursday." "Yes, we know about that meeting. It was preliminary and she's a personal acquaintance, not yet formally retained, which means privilege doesn't apply. You haven't gone to the SEC. You haven't gone to the FBI. You've been sitting on it because you don't know who to trust." He paused. "We're offering you a way out of that problem. By threatening me in a parking garage. By giving you an alternative to consequences you may not fully appreciate yet." One of the men behind her had moved closer. She could hear his footsteps on the wet concrete. The exit ramp was blocked. Her car was blocked. Her phone felt useless in her hand. A distress call would take minutes to produce any response, and she didn't have minutes. "The drive," Fenn said, and extended his hand. Sienna looked at his open palm. She thought about 14 months of careful work. She thought about the names in those files, not just the executives, but the city inspectors who'd approved fraudulent bids, the municipal officials who'd signed off on inflated contracts, the construction companies that had pocketed the difference while bridges and water systems were built below specification in cities where ordinary people lived. She thought about a water main in Rockford that had failed 2 winters ago, flooding 2 blocks of a residential neighborhood, and whether that failure traced back to what she was carrying in her blazer pocket. "No," she said. Fenn's expression didn't change much. He lowered his hand. He glanced at the 2 men behind her and gave a small nod, the kind of nod that meant we're done talking. She heard the footsteps close in. Then she heard something else. A cart. The sound of rubber wheels on concrete, uneven, one wheel slightly sticky, making a faint rhythmic squeak. And behind the cart, pushed with one hand, a man in gray work clothes walking with the particular unhurried quality of someone who was exactly where he was supposed to be and had nowhere else to be and knew it. He had a toolbox sitting on top of the cart and a small equipment bag over one shoulder. He was wearing a Meridian Tower Facilities badge, the kind that clipped to a breast pocket, and he was looking at the clipboard in his other hand with the vague, distracted focus of someone checking off a maintenance list. He appeared at first glance to be paying no attention to any of them. He stopped when he was about 15 feet away. Not because he'd been told to, because that was where he stopped. He set the clipboard down on his cart, unhurried. "Evening," he said. No one responded. He looked up then. His eyes moved across the 5 men, then to Sienna, then back to the men nearest her, the 2 who had moved up behind her. His face was difficult to read. He wasn't alarmed. He wasn't performing calm the way frightened people sometimes did. He was just still. "You all right?" he asked Sienna. "She's fine," Fenn said. "This is a private conversation. Keep moving." The man looked at Fenn. Then he looked at Sienna again, and she saw something shift in his expression, a small tightening, so brief she wasn't certain she'd read it correctly. "Ma'am," he said, "are you all right?" She opened her mouth, and the man behind her right shoulder moved. Not a full lunge, more of a repositioning, a closing of the gap. And what happened next was so fast and so quiet that Sienna would spend the next several days trying to reconstruct it from the security footage, watching the 12 seconds of recording over and over, trying to find moments she'd missed in real time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appear to hurry. The 2 men behind her were the first. One caught an elbow strike to the throat that sat him down on the concrete before he'd finished moving, and the second took a wrist lock that ended with a sound she felt in her back teeth and the man folding forward and going still. The whole exchange took less than 3 seconds, and then the maintenance worker had stepped past her and was already moving toward the 2 men near her car, and they were moving to meet him, which turned out to be the wrong decision. One of them threw a punch that connected with nothing. The counterstrike was a palm to the jaw and then a controlled takedown that kept the man's head from hitting the concrete floor too hard, which, in retrospect, struck her as a strange courtesy. The 4th man managed to get his arm around the maintenance worker's neck from behind, and she thought, she was certain, that it would slow him down. But he dropped, pulled, and the man flipped over him with a yelp that echoed in the concrete space and landed flat on his back. Fenn hadn't moved. He stood with his hand still extended where he'd reached for the drive, and now he was looking at the maintenance worker the way a man looks at something that has radically reorganized his understanding of the situation. The maintenance worker straightened up. He was breathing, but not hard. He had a small cut at the corner of his mouth. She didn't know when that had happened, and he touched it with the back of his hand once, briefly, and then his attention went back to Fenn. "Okay," Fenn said. His voice had changed completely. The tired, comfortable quality was gone. "Okay." He looked at the 4 men on the floor, at the one near the exit ramp who was calculating his odds and visibly finding them poor. He looked back at the maintenance worker. "You understand what you just did?" "I do," the man said. His voice was even, not especially deep, not particularly hard, just even. You should call someone to come get your people," the man said. "And then you should leave." Fenn was quiet for a moment. He straightened his jacket, an automatic gesture, the kind of thing hands do when a person's mind is elsewhere. Then he walked toward the exit ramp, and the man there moved aside for him, and they both disappeared into the stairwell. Sienna stood in the middle of the parking garage and listened to the rain outside and the sounds of four men slowly recovering on the concrete floor. The maintenance worker picked up a man's dropped phone, looked at it without interest, and set it on the hood of the car nearest him. He went back to his cart. He picked up his clipboard. "You need to call the police," he said. He wasn't looking at her. "Yes," she said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "I know. I will." A beat. Did you get hurt?" He touched the corner of his mouth again. "No. Those men, you should call the police," he said again. "Don't stay here alone." He started to move his cart, that same unhurried pace, heading back toward the service corridor at the far end of the level. "Wait," she said. He stopped but didn't turn around. "What's your name?" A pause. A short one. "Cole," he said. "I'm Sienna." "I know who you are," he said. And then he pushed the cart through the service door, and the door swung shut behind him, and she was alone with the rain and the concrete and four men who were beginning to sit up and groan. She called the police. She called her attorney, actually called her this time, not a text, an actual call, and spoke for 11 minutes in a low, precise voice while sitting in her car with the doors locked. 2 officers arrived within 6 minutes, 3 more within 15. The garage became a scene of statements and photographs and the particular organized confusion of official response. She told them everything except the contents of the flash drive. That was still in her blazer pocket. She wasn't ready to hand that over yet. Not until she knew more about the chain of custody, not until she knew her attorney was physically present and had reviewed the evidentiary protocol. She wasn't obstructing. She was being careful. There was a difference, and she was aware that the difference might not hold up under pressure, and she filed that as something to address in the next 24 hours. The security supervisor for Meridian Tower met with her while the officers finished processing the scene. He was a heavy-set man named Gus, visibly agitated, who had pulled up the Level 2 footage on a tablet and watched it twice with her beside him. "He works nights," Gus said, watching the 12 seconds again. "Contracted through Apex Facilities. Been here, I'd have to check, but 8-9 months. "Cole," she said. Yeah, Cole Maddox. "You said he told you his name." "Just his first name." Gus watched the footage a third time, the tablet tilted toward himself now, not sharing. His expression was that of a man trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew. "You ever see anything like that?" he asked, mostly to himself. She had not. She left the garage at 10:40 p.m., drove 11 blocks in the rain, and parked outside her attorney's building to wait for her to come down. While she waited, she looked up Cole Maddox. It took longer than she expected. He had a minimal digital footprint, a listed business registration for a one-man facilities contracting operation, a mailing address in Bridgeport, a profile on the Apex Facilities Contractor database that listed his certifications and work history and nothing else. No social media she could find. No news articles. The business registration was 2 years old. Before Apex Facilities, the record thinned out considerably. There were gaps that had a particular shape to them. The shape of records that didn't exist because they'd been filed somewhere that didn't interface with the public databases she was using, or records that had been deliberately quiet. She was not experienced at reading those gaps, but she recognized them as gaps. One thing she did find: a brief obituary notice, 18 months old, in a Bridgeport neighborhood paper. Rachel Maddox, 31, is survived by her husband and daughter. That was all it said. No cause of death listed. No additional details. She sat with that for a moment, the rain on her windshield, the orange light of the street filtering through. Her attorney knocked on the car window at 11:05, and Sienna unlocked the door, and they drove to her apartment and talked until nearly 2 in the morning about what came next, and all of it was important and necessary. But she kept thinking, in the spaces between the legal strategy, about the sound of a maintenance cart with one sticky wheel, and a man who'd looked at 5 people in a parking garage, and experienced what appeared to be the absence of surprise. The footage went up at 7:14 a.m. the next morning. She didn't upload it. She would never find out precisely who did, one of the responding officers most likely, or someone in the building's security office. The clip was 12 seconds long and showed almost nothing legible. 4 figures going down in a sequence so compressed it barely registered as individual events. Just a blur of motion and then 4 people on the ground. No faces were visible at useful resolution. The maintenance badge was a gray rectangle. The clipboard, the cart, the sticky wheel. None of it translated to an identity. It didn't matter. By 9 a.m., it had 400,000 views. By noon, it had crossed 2 million. The caption someone had attached read, "Parking garage in Chicago last night. Never found out who this guy is." The comment section was a mixture of speculation, disbelief, and a recurring theme that the clip had been staged or enhanced. Positions that collapsed as the Meridian Tower security supervisor confirmed its authenticity to 2 separate local news stations by 1 p.m. Sienna watched the coverage from her office. She'd come in, which was probably inadvisable but felt necessary, because disappearing would signal something she wasn't ready to signal, and tracked the media's attempts to identify the man in the gray work clothes. They had a name by 4 p.m. She didn't know how they'd gotten it. Probably someone at Apex Facilities who'd made a decision they'd regret. Cole Maddox, the chyron read. And then, former military. Details unclear. Works as maintenance contractor. She turned off the monitor. She already knew she was going to find him. She'd known since 10:40 p.m. the night before, sitting in the rain with the flash drive in her blazer pocket, watching him push a cart through a service door. She hadn't worked out why yet, not fully, whether it was gratitude or strategy or something else she wasn't naming yet. She knew that she needed help from someone she could trust, and that the people she was supposed to trust had just tried to corner her in a parking garage, and that the only person who'd stepped between her and those 5 men had been a man with a clipboard and nowhere to be. Outside her window, Chicago went about its business in the rain, indifferent and ongoing. She picked up her phone and called Gus at Meridian Tower. "I need an address," she said. The address Gus gave her was a 2-flat on South Carpenter Street in Bridgeport, a narrow brick building with a chain-link fence around a small front yard and a single maple tree that had lost most of its leaves to the October rain. The neighborhood was working class and quiet, in the way that working class neighborhoods are quiet at 8 in the morning on a Wednesday. A few cars warming up, a woman pulling a wheeled grocery cart down the sidewalk, a dog barking somewhere behind a fence. Sienna sat in her car across the street for a moment before getting out. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't known how to call ahead. Cole Maddox didn't appear to have a listed number, and showing up at his workplace felt wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Something about the gap between his world and hers, the 40-story building, and the maintenance cart. She'd decided that showing up at his home was only marginally less awkward, and had driven here anyway. She was halfway up the front walk when the door opened. He was wearing jeans and a gray thermal shirt and holding a coffee mug. He looked at her without particular surprise, which she was starting to understand might just be how his face worked. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. "Sienna," she said. "Please." A pause. He glanced past her at her car, a black Audi, probably the most expensive thing on the block by a significant margin, and then back at her. "How'd you get this address?" "Gus at Meridian gave it to me." Of course he did. He didn't sound angry, just resigned. He looked at her for a moment, weighing something, and then stepped back from the door. "You want coffee?" She did want coffee. She hadn't slept well. The apartment was small and clean in the way that small apartments get clean when someone has made a deliberate effort. Not spotless, but organized, surfaces clear, dishes done. There was a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator, a crayon rendering of what appeared to be 2 people and a dog, though they didn't have a dog. A small pair of sneakers sat beside the front door, toes lined up with the baseboard. She sat at the kitchen table while he poured a second mug. He set it in front of her and sat across from her and waited. "She's at school," he said, before she could ask. "Emma. She's 6. I drop her at 7:40. "I wasn't going to—" "You looked at the shoes," he said. Not accusatory, just observational. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was plain and black and strong, and she didn't ask for anything to put in it. "The footage is everywhere," she said. "I know." "They got your name." "I know that too." "Does that—" She stopped, adjusted. How are you handling that? He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite impatience, but lived somewhere in between. I'm sitting in my kitchen, he said. How do you think I'm handling it? She almost smiled. Fair enough. She set the mug down. I came to say thank you, that's the first thing. I haven't said it properly, and I wanted to. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway. She looked at him directly. What you did last night, boss, those weren't 5 ordinary men. Ben, the one who was doing the talking, he was a board advisor. He had resources behind him, and you just walked into it. I didn't walk into anything, Cole said. I was doing a maintenance check on the fire suppression system on level 2. I heard your voice. A beat. You sounded calm, which is usually worse than scared. Is that a thing? In my experience, she picked up the mug again. Outside, a car passed on the street. From somewhere upstairs came the muffled sound of a television. His upstairs neighbor, she guessed. What's your experience? She asked. Not casually, she'd been building to it. He looked at her over his coffee. You already looked me up, he said. Whatever you found, you found. Not much. The gaps were more informative than what was there. Something in his face shifted, fractional. I was in the Navy, he said, for 11 years. What did you do in the Navy? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she got the sense he was choosing precision over brevity. I was part of a unit that handled situations that didn't respond well to conventional approaches, he said. We went places that weren't on schedules, did things that weren't in reports. I was good at it. He picked up his mug, looked into it. I left 4 years ago. Because of your wife. He went very still, not the stillness of a man shutting down, more like a man who has learned to absorb impacts without showing the landing. I saw the obituary, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. No. He set the mug down. Rachel. He said the name carefully, the way you say something you've trained yourself to say without flinching. She died in a car accident. Emma was 2. I was overseas when it happened. He paused. I got the call at 3 a.m. local time. I was on the other side of the world, and my daughter had just lost her mother. His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. I put in my papers 8 weeks later. Sienna didn't say she was sorry again. She'd said it once, and it had been true, and saying it twice would make it smaller. Emma's lucky, she said instead, to have a father who chose her. Cole looked at her. For the first time since she'd sat down, his expression was completely unguarded, just for a moment, and what she saw there was complex enough that she didn't try to name it. Is that why you're here? He asked. To tell me that? No, she said. I'm here because I need help, and you're the only person I've met in the last 6 months who I'm reasonably certain isn't working against me. He said nothing. The men last night were the visible layer, she said. Fen organized it, but Fen doesn't organize things like that on his own. He's an operator. Someone built the structure he's operating inside, and that structure goes through my company. I have evidence, financial records, internal communications, 14 months of accumulation. What I don't have is someone who can help me understand the operational side. Who's coordinating? How far it reaches? Whether the people I'm about to trust with this information are actually trustworthy. She stopped. I have lawyers. I have a forensic accountant on retainer. What I don't have is someone who knows how networks like this work from the inside. He was quiet for a long moment. I'm a maintenance contractor, he said. You're a former Navy SEAL who's been watching me work in that building for 9 months and apparently had a thorough enough read on the situation last night to take 5 men apart in 12 seconds without hurting any of them badly enough to complicate my legal situation. She paused. That last part wasn't an accident, was it? The restraint. He didn't answer, which was an answer. I'm not asking you to do anything illegal, she said. I'm not asking you to go back into anything resembling what you used to do. I'm asking you to advise, to sit with me and the information I have and help me understand the shape of what I'm looking at, to tell me when I'm about to do something that looks right on paper but gets someone hurt in practice. She picked up the mug, then put it back down without drinking. I'll pay you for your time, whatever rate you think is fair. It's not about the rate. I know. He got up and went to the window, stood there looking out at the street with his back to her. She waited. She was reasonably good at waiting. "Why not go straight to the FBI?" he said, without turning around. "I may. Probably I will eventually, but once I do, I lose control of the investigation. If there are people inside Halcyon who are clean, employees who had no idea, people who've been working in good faith, I want to understand the scope before I hand it over. I don't want to burn the building down to get the rot out." "That's a nice sentiment," he said. "It's also a way to get yourself killed if you wait too long." "I know that too." He turned around. He looked at her for a moment, then at the crayon drawing on the refrigerator, then back at her. "I need to think about it," he said. "Okay. I'm not saying yes." "I understand." He walked her to the door. She was on the front step when he said, "Fen, the one who was talking, he called you by your first name." She stopped. "Yes. Someone inside your company told him to do that. It was deliberate, designed to unsettle you, make you feel like the gap between formal address and first name was something he controlled." He leaned against the door frame. "They briefed him on your psychology. Someone who knows you well enough to give that kind of briefing." She stood on the front step in the cold morning air and let that land. "How many people know you well enough?" he asked. "Not many," she said. "That's the problem." She walked back to her car. She didn't look back at the house, but she heard the door close, and somehow the sound of it, unhurried, final, didn't feel like a refusal. Yeah. He called her at 6:47 that evening. Emma was in the bath, and he was sitting on the closed toilet lid reading the same paragraph of a paperback for the third time while she argued against shampooing her hair. "I'll do it," he said when Sienna picked up. A pause. "Okay. Not as an employee. Not on a retainer. I'll look at what you have, and I'll tell you what I think. If it's beyond what I can actually help with, I'll tell you that too." "That's fair. And I don't come to Halcyon. I don't appear in any building where your cameras are rolling or your staff can see me. We meet somewhere neutral." "Done." "And Sienna." He heard Emma splash something aggressively in the background of his own thoughts, snapping him back. "If at any point I think this is going to put Emma at risk, if I think the people behind this are going to start looking at me because of you, I stop. Immediately. No argument." "No argument," she said. "Absolutely." He hung up and looked at the bathroom door for a moment, listening to the water. "Dad," Emma called, "I need the blue cup." "Which blue cup?" "The blue one." He got up, found the blue cup on the back edge of the sink where it always was, and handed it around the shower curtain without looking. Small fingers grabbed it. "Dad," Emma said, in a different voice now, the one that meant she'd been thinking about something and had decided to ask it. "Yeah. But Caitlin's mom said you were on the news." He sat back down on the closed toilet lid. "Who's Caitlin?" "From my class. She said her mom showed her a video." He exhaled. "I was on the news a little bit, yeah." "Why?" "I helped someone." A pause, full of the sound of water. "Did you get in trouble?" "No." "Okay." She seemed to file this away. "Can we have pancakes tomorrow?" "It's a school day. Pancakes are for every day. That's not a thing." "It should be a thing." He almost said something, then didn't. He picked up his paperback and stared at it without reading. Outside, a bus went by on the street, and the windows rattled faintly, the way they always did. They met the following Saturday at a coffee shop in Logan Square that Sienna had chosen because it wasn't the kind of place anyone who knew her would think to look. She arrived in jeans and a plain coat with her hair pulled back, no makeup, and he'd nodded when he saw her, acknowledging, he supposed, that she'd understood what he'd meant by neutral, by not calling attention to herself. She had a bag with her. Inside the bag was a laptop and a printed folder 4 inches thick. They took a corner table. She ordered a black coffee. He ordered the same. The music in the place was low and indistinct, some kind of acoustic arrangement, and the Saturday morning crowd was dense enough to absorb conversation without amplifying it. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Not the beginning of the evidence. The beginning of when you first noticed something was wrong." She looked at him. "That's not where I expected you to start. The evidence tells you what happened. The sequence tells you who." She nodded slowly, and then she started talking. She talked for nearly an hour. He didn't interrupt much. He asked 3 questions, each one precise and located at exactly the right moment. Not to display comprehension, but to redirect her towards something she'd glossed over, a detail that had seemed minor to her, but that he wanted her to return to. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the table for a while. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" 3 things. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, not a nervous gesture, just something for his hands to do. First, whoever is running this inside Halcyon isn't running it alone. The structure of the transfers you're describing, the way they're layered across subsidiaries, that requires someone with treasury-level access and someone with audit-level access working in concert. One person can't do both without leaving a pattern a competent forensic accountant would catch, which means they've already identified your forensic accountant as a risk. She felt the skin on her arms tighten. "Dr. Warwick. Has he behaved normally? Any canceled meetings, unusual requests, anything that felt off?" She thought about it. "He asked to delay our next review session. Said he had a scheduling conflict." "When did he ask?" 2 days after the garage." Cole said nothing, but something in his stillness communicated clearly enough. "You think they got to him," she said. "I think it's worth assuming they tried." He picked up his coffee. "Second thing, Ben showing up in person was a mistake, and I don't think it was his call. The people above him don't want direct exposure. That's the whole point of building a network with layers. Someone panicked and pushed Fenn forward before they were ready, which means your timeline of 14 months wasn't known to them until recently. Something you did in the last 3 or 4 weeks tipped them." She went back through it. "I requested a second copy of the 2021 subsidiary audit from the records department." "Who processed that request?" "I don't know. I went through the standard internal channel." "Find out who processed it," he said. "That's probably where the leak is." She was writing on a small notepad she'd taken from her bag. Not typing, handwriting. He'd noticed that about her already. She was more careful than she appeared, or more careful than the position implied. Most people in her position processed everything digitally without thinking about it. She was thinking about it. "Third thing," he said. She looked up from the notepad. "You said you don't know who to trust inside your company." He paused. "Give me names. People you worked closest with, people who've had access to your movements and your work product over the last year. Don't edit. Just give me the list." "That feels like—" "I know what it feels like," he said. "Do it anyway." She did. 6 names, written on the notepad, torn out, and slid across the table. He looked at them for a moment and then folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. "I'm not going to do anything with these," he said. "I just want to hold them while I think." "How do you think?" He looked at her with a faint expression she couldn't quite classify. "Slowly," he said, "and usually wrong the first time." That surprised her into a short laugh, the first one she'd produced in several days, and it felt strange in her chest, like a muscle she'd forgotten she had. Over the following 2 weeks, they met 4 more times. Never at the same location twice. Never with advance notice longer than a few hours. He set those parameters without explaining them, and she followed them without asking why, which told him something about her capacity for operational discipline that reassured him more than most things could have. What he found, working through her documentation with the methodical patience that 11 years of compartmentalized fieldwork had drilled into him, was a network that was considerably more sophisticated than its visible edges suggested. The 5 men in the parking garage were, as he'd suspected from the first night, the least interesting part of the architecture. They were muscle and intimidation, the kind of layer that gets deployed when the invisible mechanisms have already failed. The invisible mechanisms were what mattered. Halcyon Group's corporate structure included 9 subsidiary entities operating across 4 states. 3 of those entities were legitimate business operations. 4 were functional. They moved product, maintained contracts, employed people, but had been gradually hollowed out over 7 years. Their municipal contracts inflated. Their project completion records falsified in ways that would only be visible if you were looking specifically and knew what pattern to look for. The remaining 2 were shells, incorporated in Delaware, maintained with enough surface activity to survive routine scrutiny, existing primarily to receive and redistribute funds. The architecture was elegant in the way that things designed by intelligent, patient people are elegant. It had redundancy built in. It had contingencies. It had clean breaks between the layers so that if one layer was exposed, the layer above it could deny knowledge. Cole had seen structures like this before, not in corporate settings, in other contexts, other geographies, other kinds of organized purpose. The design logic was the same. Someone had built this who understood how networks fail under investigation and had engineered against those failure points. That someone was not Douglas Fenn. Fenn was a former CFO who'd been pushed out of a major corporation 6 years ago for what the public records described as strategic differences with the board, a phrase that could mean almost anything. He had enough financial sophistication to manage the operational layer. He didn't have the systems background to have designed the architecture. Cole told Sienna this at their 4th meeting, a Tuesday morning at a diner in Pilsen, over eggs neither of them was particularly focused on eating. "So there's someone above Fenn," she said. "Above Fenn and probably unknown to most of the people in the layers below him. That's how these things are built. The top knows everything. Everyone else knows only what they need to know to do their specific piece." She was quiet, turning her coffee cup. Outside the diner window, the street was bright and cold, people moving fast in the November wind. "Do you know who it is?" she asked. "Not yet. But you have a direction." He picked up his fork, then put it back down. "The 2021 audit you requested a copy of. I looked at the original filing date and the internal routing. It went through a man named Preston Hale. He's your director of records management." "Preston." She said it flatly, with the particular quality of someone filing away an emotional response for later. "He's been with Halcyon for 11 years, 3 years before the scheme started. He has a daughter in college. His wife had cancer. She's in remission now. She stopped. "I sent flowers when she was diagnosed." "I know," Cole said. "That's in the company newsletter archive from 2022. She looked at him. "You read the company newsletters." "I read everything you gave me." She sat back in his booth. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and caught the tiredness in her face, and she didn't try to hide it, which he'd come to understand was a thing about her. She didn't perform composure, she just had it, and when it frayed, she didn't scramble to patch it. "Preston didn't build this," she said. "No, but he may know who did, whether voluntarily or not." "You think he was pressured?" "I think a man with a sick wife and a kid in college and 11 years of institutional loyalty is exactly the kind of person someone patient and intelligent targets when they need an inside piece." He paused. "That's not an excuse, but it's probably a more accurate picture than a co-conspirator." She nodded slowly. She was doing that thing again, processing with a stillness that he'd initially read as detachment and had revised to something more like she felt things deeply and refused to let the feeling override the function. "What do we do with Preston?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "We don't do anything with anyone yet. We keep building the map. When we have enough of the structure identified, when we can put names to the layers, then we go to the FBI and we walk in with something that doesn't leave room for maneuvering." He looked at her. "If we move too early, the top of the structure disappears. Whoever designed this built in an exit. We need to close the exit before we knock on the door." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've done this before," she said. "Not exactly this, but something like this." He picked up his coffee. "Eat your eggs," he said. She almost smiled. "You're deflecting." "I'm redirecting," he said. "There's a difference." She picked up her fork, and something in the moment settled between them. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer uncomfortable, which was its own kind of shift. He noticed it and didn't remark on it. She noticed it too, he could tell, and also said nothing. They ate in the morning light while the city moved outside the window, and he thought about the map they were building, all its incomplete edges, and the person at the top of it who was almost certainly aware that the situation had changed, that the garage hadn't gone as planned, that silence hadn't been purchased, that something else was now in motion. He thought about Emma, at school 8 blocks from their apartment, drawing things in her notebook during free period. She'd told him last night she was drawing a cat that could fly. She was calling it a sky cat. and how the distance between this diner and that classroom was both very short and the most important measurement in his life. He thought about what Sienna had said at his kitchen table the first morning, before he'd agreed to anything. "You're the only person I've met in the last 6 months who I'm reasonably certain isn't working against me." He'd taken that as context for her request. He was starting to think it was also just true, that she'd said it because it was accurate, and accuracy was how she handled most things, including the ones that cost her something to say. He refilled his coffee from the carafe the waitress had left on the table. Outside, a woman was trying to fold a stroller with one hand while holding a toddler with the other, and failing at both. And a man passing her stopped and held the toddler without being asked, standing there patiently while she got the stroller folded, then handed the child back and kept walking. Cole watched this and said nothing about it. Sienna was looking at her notepad. "The subsidiary in Decatur," she said, tapping a figure with her pen. "The contract variance here is almost $4 million. Is that the place to start?" He turned his attention back to the table. "Show me," he said, and they went back to work. The name came to Cole on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the diner in Pilsen, at 11:40 at night while he was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a spreadsheet he'd been staring at for 2 hours. He'd printed everything Sienna had given him, all of it, the financial transfers, the internal communications, the subsidiary records, and spread it across the table in an arrangement that looked, to anyone who might have walked in, like the work of someone coming apart. But it wasn't chaos. It was a method he'd developed over years of working with incomplete intelligence. Lay everything flat, remove the digital distance, let the eyes find patterns the screen obscured. What he'd been circling for 3 weeks was the architectural question. Fenn managed the operational layer. Preston Hale had been the inside access point, the man who'd routed the audit request and flagged Sienna's activity upward. But neither of them had the background to design the shell structure, the intersubsidiary routing, the layered redundancy that made the whole thing resistant to standard forensic accounting. That required someone who understood both financial engineering and operational security. Someone who'd thought about how investigations worked and built the network to survive one. Cole had been looking in the wrong category. He'd been looking for a financial architect, someone with a banking or securities background, someone who'd designed complex structures before. What the spreadsheet was finally showing him, in the particular way that patterns reveal themselves only after you've stopped trying to force them, was that the architecture wasn't primarily financial. It was logistical. The shell companies didn't exist to hide money in the way financial criminals typically hid money. They existed to create distance, specifically the kind of distance between decision and consequence that operational planners built into high-risk field structures. Whoever designed this had thought like a field commander, not a CFO. He sat back in his chair. On Halcyon's board of directors, listed as an independent director since 8 years ago, 1 year before the scheme began, was a man named Victor Crane, formerly a managing director at a defunct private equity firm. Before that, 12 years in defense contracting, primarily logistics and infrastructure, with 2 of those years spent advising municipal governments on large-scale contract procurement. Cole looked at that biography for a long time. Defense contracting, infrastructure, municipal procurement. Those 3 things, in that sequence, described a man who understood exactly how government contracts were awarded, exactly where the oversight gaps were, and exactly how to build a structure that would survive the kind of audit a municipal government could afford to conduct. He texted Sienna at 11:52 p.m. "Victor Crane, tell me everything you know about him." Her response came 4 minutes later, which meant she was also awake, which meant she was also working. Independent director. Keeps to himself in meetings. Never pushes hard on anything. Why? He thought about how to say it briefly. Because the quietest person in the room built this. A long pause. Then, how certain are you? He looked at the table, all the paper, all the lines he'd drawn between things. Nothing in intelligence work was certain. Certainty was what you performed when the operation was over and the after-action report needed a clean narrative. During the operation, you worked with probability and you stayed honest about the edges. "Enough to move," he wrote back. "We need to talk tomorrow." She came to Bridgeport the next morning. He'd asked her to, which he wouldn't have done a month ago. He'd kept their meetings away from his apartment as a default, some instinct about separation, about keeping the two parts of his life in different physical spaces. But Emma was at school, and the apartment felt like the right place for this particular conversation. Something about the need to be in a space where he trusted the walls. She sat at the kitchen table again, in the same chair she'd sat in the first time, and he walked her through everything: the architecture, the logistics background, the timeline that placed Crane's appointment to the Halcyon board 1 year before the earliest traceable transaction. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat very still for a moment. "I've been in the same room as him 40 times, she said. "I know. He came to my father's memorial service." But Cole said nothing. "He's 70 years old, she said. "He has grandchildren. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "Okay." She pressed both palms flat on the table. "Okay. What do we do with this?" "We go to the FBI," he said. "Now. We have enough of the structure mapped that walking away is the wrong call. Crane will know by now that the garage failed. He'll know the evidence hasn't been surrendered. He's been quiet for 3 weeks, which doesn't mean he's inactive. It means he's rebuilding." "Rebuilding what?" "His options," Cole said. "When the direct approach fails, someone like Crane doesn't panic. He recalculates. He looks at the board and finds the next move." "What's the next move?" He'd been thinking about this since before the name came to him. "He can't touch you directly again. Too much visibility after the garage. He can't buy off your attorney at this point. You've formalized the relationship. He can try to move the assets faster, liquidate the shells, but that creates a pattern any decent forensic team will catch." He paused. "What he can do is discredit you before you get to the authorities. Create a narrative that makes your evidence look like the work of a CEO trying to cover her own involvement. Frame you as the architect." The color didn't leave her face, but something behind her eyes went flat and focused. "He'd need documentation. He's had 7 years to prepare contingencies. I'd assume the documentation exists." She was quiet for a moment. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Less time than we did a week ago." She pulled out her phone and called her attorney on speaker without asking if that was all right. And he was glad she didn't ask, because the time for careful compartmentalization between those two relationships was over. The attorney, a precise, quick-minded woman named Dana Chu, whom Cole had formed a cautious respect for over 2 phone calls, listened to the summary without interruption and was quiet for approximately 4 seconds before she said, "I'll contact the FBI field office this afternoon. I know the ASAC who handles financial crimes. We go in Monday morning with everything. Full disclosure, full cooperation." "Monday," Sienna said. "It's Friday. I need the weekend to organize the evidentiary package in a format that doesn't give them room to pick at the chain of custody. Cole, I need you to write up your analytical process, how you identified Crane, what you traced, the logic chain. In your own words, not legal language, just what you found and how." "I can do that," he said. "Good." A pause. "Sienna, go somewhere this weekend that isn't your apartment and isn't Halcyon. Somewhere you'd plausibly go anyway." "I have a charity gala Saturday night," Sienna said. "The Meridian Foundation dinner. I've been committed to it for months. I was going to skip it." "Don't skip it," Dana said immediately. "Skipping it looks like flight. Go. Stay 2 hours. Leave normally." Cole had been listening to this with a stillness that Sienna had learned to read as active, as processing. "Who else knows about the gala?" he asked. "It's public," Sienna said. "It's on the Foundation's website. The guest list is—" She stopped. "It's on the Halcyon website, under my public calendar." He looked at her. "Dana," he said, "can the Monday meeting be moved to Sunday?" A pause. "I'd have to make some calls." "Make them," he said. He spent Friday evening writing up his analytical process at the kitchen table while Emma watched television in the living room, something with animated animals that she'd explained to him in elaborate detail at dinner, and that he'd mostly retained because she'd been so specific about the plot logic. At 8 o'clock, she came to the kitchen doorway in her pajamas and leaned against the frame. "You're working a lot lately," she said. "Yeah." He kept typing. "Is it for the lady?" He looked up. "What lady?" "Caitlin's mom said the lady from the video came to our house." He set his hands flat on the table. The Bridgeport neighborhood operated on a communication network that would have impressed military intelligence. "Her name is Sienna. She needed some help with something." Emma considered this with the grave, evaluative attention she brought to most new information. Is she nice? Yeah, she's a good person. Is she your friend? He thought about it. I think so. We're getting there. Emma nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. She can come to dinner sometime if she wants, she said. I'll tell her about the Sky Cat. I'll pass that along. Make sure you actually do it, Emma said, with the particular firmness she deployed when she suspected he might forget, which he sometimes did. And then she went back to her animated animals, and he sat for a moment looking at the doorway before he went back to writing. The Meridian Foundation Gala was held Saturday evening at the Ashford Hotel on Michigan Avenue, in a ballroom that had been dressed for the occasion in blue and white, the foundation's colors, with round tables and a small stage and the particular formal warmth of a charity event where the people attending had money and the organizations receiving it did not. Sienna arrived at 7 in a dark blue dress she'd worn to a different event 2 years ago, because she hadn't had the mental space this week to think about what else to wear. She'd told Cole she was going. He'd told her to text him when she arrived and every 45 minutes after that. She'd told him that was excessive. He'd looked at her. She'd agreed to text him. She texted him at 7:08 from the coat check line. The first hour was unremarkable in the way that gala hours were unremarkable. Conversations that were 90% professional and 10% personal, people asking about Halcyon's recovery plans after the board instability that had made the business press in October. People who knew about the garage and had the decency not to mention it, people who didn't know and asked why she seemed tired. She said she had a lot on her plate. Everyone nodded. Everyone understood. At 8:15, she texted Cole, "All fine, boring. 2 more presentations, then I'm leaving." His response, "Stay with people. Don't go anywhere alone." She texted back, "I know." Then, because she was slightly tired of being managed, even appropriately, "I was running a company while you were still checking fire suppression systems." A pause. Then, "Fair enough. Still, stay with people." She pocketed her phone. The second presentation had just started, a representative from a literacy nonprofit that the foundation had supported for 3 years. A young woman who was clearly nervous and reading from notes and doing fine despite it, when Sienna felt the particular alertness that came from something peripheral registering before the conscious mind had processed it. 2 men she didn't recognize had come in through the side entrance. Not guests. Their clothes were right, but their posture was wrong, and they weren't looking at the stage. They were looking at the room, the exits, the tables. She picked up her phone and typed, "2 men I don't recognize, side entrance, something's wrong." She hit send and stood up from her table, doing it slowly, without urgency, the way you stand up when you need to visit the restroom and don't want to interrupt the program. She touched the arm of the foundation director beside her and said something meaningless about a phone call, and the director nodded and she walked toward the hallway that led to the lobby. She'd been in the hallway for approximately 8 seconds when a hand closed around her upper arm. "Ms. Ashcroft." The voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone who did this as an occupation. "Someone would like to speak with you." "I'm sure they would," she said. She kept her voice level. Her heart was doing something rapid and unhelpful. "This is a public event. This won't take long." She thought about screaming. The hallway had 2 other people in it, farther down, near the elevators. She thought about the math of that, the distance, the response time, what this won't take long meant in practice. A second man had materialized behind her. She went with them, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fighting in a hotel hallway with 2 professional men who outweighed her wasn't a plan. Going with them, staying conscious, staying observant, keeping her phone in her hand, that was a plan, or the beginning of one. They took her through a service corridor that smelled of cleaning products and food cart metal, through a door that required a key card, into a freight elevator. The man holding her arm let go when the elevator doors closed, which she registered as professional habit. No marks, no physical evidence, and stood 2 feet away from her while the other man watched the floor numbers. Her phone was still in her hand. She typed without looking at it, feeling for the keys. Service elevator, taken. Still in hotel. She didn't know if it sent. The elevator was moving. Cole was 11 blocks away when the first text came through. He read it and was already moving before he'd finished the second word. His jacket was on and his keys were in his hand, and he was out the door of the apartment in the same motion, running the calculation as he went down the stairs. 11 blocks, traffic, Saturday night on Michigan Avenue, 8 minutes minimum by car, probably 12. He called Dana Chu as he got into the truck. "They took her," he said when she picked up. A pause of exactly 1 second. "Where?" "Ashford Hotel. She's in a service elevator. I have a partial text." He pulled out of the parking space. "Call the FBI contact now, tonight, not Sunday, and call Chicago PD. I need units at the Ashford in the next 5 minutes. Cole, I'm going in." He ended the call. He thought, briefly, about whether this was the right decision. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. He was one person. He didn't know how many people Crane had deployed tonight. He didn't have a weapon, a vest, backup, a communication channel, or anything except the 11 years of pattern recognition that told him that waiting for an official response while Sienna was being moved through a service corridor was the wrong call, and that the official response would arrive to find whatever condition she was in after the fact. He drove. He reached the Ashford in 9 minutes, which was 3 minutes faster than he'd calculated, because the Saturday night traffic on Michigan had a gap in it that he took without hesitation. He left the truck in a loading zone and went in through the side entrance, the same one the 2 men had used, which was not coincidence. It was the entrance that had the lowest camera density on the building's exterior, which told him someone had done a site survey. The lobby was still in gala mode, people moving between the ballroom and the bar, nobody alarmed yet. He went to the service corridor, tried the door. Locked. He went to the hotel's front desk and said, in the calm voice of a man who needed something practical, "I'm with the foundation event. We have a vendor delivery that went to the wrong entrance. Can someone let me into the service corridor?" The desk clerk looked at his clothes, jacket, plain shirt, the maintenance contractor presentation that he'd never really stopped inhabiting, and said, "Just a second," and called someone. And 40 seconds later, a young man in hotel blacks was unlocking the service corridor door. Cole walked in without hurrying. The corridor was empty, but there were sounds at the far end. Not voices, just the kind of muffled presence that enclosed spaces carried. He moved along the wall, quiet in the way that had been drilled into him until it was no longer a technique, but a default, and passed the freight elevator and continued to the corridor's end, where a second door was propped open with a rubber wedge. Beyond the door was a service staging area, the kind of room that held folding tables and stacked chairs and equipment cases for events. 3 men. Sienna on a chair with her hands free, but 2 of the men standing close, and a 4th figure that Cole placed immediately. Not one of the hired crew, not dressed for physical work, standing near the back wall with his hands in his overcoat pockets, watching. Victor Crane. He was exactly as he appeared in his board director photograph. Slight, composed, the white hair of a man who had been old for a long time. He looked, at 70, like someone's grandfather, like a man you'd see feeding ducks in a park, and he was watching Sienna with an expression of mild patience that was the most disturbing thing in the room. Cole took in the layout in the way he'd been trained to take in a room. 3 standing men, 2 with physical positioning that indicated combat readiness, 1 near the door who wasn't paying attention the way the other 2 were. Crane against the back wall, irrelevant physically. Sienna seated, unrestrained, alert. She saw him. He watched her see him, watched her eyes locate him in the doorway, and then, with the discipline that had impressed him since the beginning, not react visibly. Her gaze moved back to Crane. "Victor," she was saying, and her voice was impressively steady, "whatever documentation you've prepared, whatever narrative you're planning to run, it won't hold. The evidentiary record is already with an attorney, it's already structured, and there are people who know exactly where I am tonight." "I know," Crane said. His voice was mild, slightly formal, the voice of a man at a board meeting. "That's why this isn't about the evidence anymore." He paused. "This is about ensuring that you understand the scope of what you're proposing to unravel. Businesses, municipal relationships, pension investments in those subsidiaries, ordinary people, Sienna, who will be affected by what you're carrying." "Ordinary people," she said flatly. "In Rockford, a water main failed 2 winters ago because the construction was below specification on a contract your network inflated by $3 million. I know about the Rockford main, Victor." Something shifted in his expression. Fractional, but real. "The evidence goes to the FBI Sunday morning," she said. That's already scheduled. Tonight changes nothing except whether I come out of this hotel by myself or not." Crane was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with something that might, on another face, have been respect. "You're braver than your father was," he said. He knew, eventually. Toward the end, he chose to look elsewhere. Sienna went very still. Cole moved. The man near the door was first, because he was the one who might prevent exit, and the technique was a pressure point takedown that was quiet and fast, and put him on the floor before the other two had registered movement. The second man turned and was competent, more competent than the garage crew, genuinely trained, and the exchange between them took longer, maybe 6 seconds, and Cole took a forearm to the jaw that snapped his head sideways and produced a bright pain that he registered and filed and didn't stop for. He got inside the man's reach and used his weight, and the man went down hard. The third moved toward Sienna, which Cole had anticipated. Using her as leverage was the logical move. And he was already between them when the man arrived, and what happened next was not elegant. It was the controlled, damaging efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about it and was operating on something older than thought, and the man ended up against the wall with both of Cole's forearms across his chest and a weight differential that kept him there. "Stay," Cole said. Just that word. The man stayed. Crane hadn't moved from the back wall. He was looking at Cole with the evaluative calm of a man who had just had a hypothesis confirmed. "You're the one from the parking garage," Crane said. "She's leaving," Cole said. "You're going to let her." "You don't have the authority to—" "I don't need authority," Cole said. He stepped back from the man against the wall who was calculating and finding the math unfavorable and staying put. "You have about 4 minutes before Chicago PD arrives at this hotel. You can spend those 4 minutes doing something useful, or you can spend them talking." Crane looked at him for a moment longer. Then he looked at Sienna, who had stood up from the chair and was standing with the straight-back composure of someone who had just been told that her father had known, had chosen silence, and was holding that information somewhere it wouldn't break her posture. "This doesn't end here," Crane said. To her, not to Cole. "No," she agreed. "It ends Sunday morning." She walked to the doorway where Cole was standing, and they went back through the service corridor without running, the rubber wedge door swinging behind them, and Cole checked the corridor in both directions before they moved, and they came out through the lobby as the first CPD units were pulling up on the street outside. The next 4 hours were police statements, hotel management, phone calls with Dana Chu, and eventually a CPD detective named Ostrowski, who had the careful eyes of someone who knew he was holding a piece of something much larger than a hotel incident and was smart enough to be patient about it. Cole had a bruise forming along his jaw where the forearm had caught him. He was aware of it the way you were aware of things that were minor and would be more annoying tomorrow than they were tonight. Sienna had looked at it once, in the corridor, just a glance, and hadn't said anything about it yet. At midnight, sitting in a hotel conference room that Ostrowski had commandeered for the interview process, she finally said something about it. "You need ice on that." "I know. I'll ask someone." "It's fine." She looked at him steadily. "Cole?" "Yeah. My father." She stopped, restarted. "If he knew—" "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "Not tonight. Tonight isn't the right size for that." She looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears and wasn't quite not. "How do you do that?" she said. "Know what size things are?" He didn't answer right away. Outside the conference room door, the hotel was quieting. The gala had ended, the guests gone, the staff dismantling blue and white decorations in the ballroom down the hall. He could hear the faint clatter of that happening, the ordinary sounds of an event concluding. "You learn," he said, "or you get it wrong enough times that eventually you figure it out." She nodded slowly. She was holding her phone, and he could see Dana Chu's number on the screen, the call she still needed to make. "Sunday morning," she said, FBI at 9 o'clock. "I'll be there," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to be." "I know," he said. She made the call. He got the ice, eventually, from a hotel staff member who handed it to him in a towel, with the professionally blank expression of someone who had learned not to ask questions about the things that happened in service corridors on gala nights. He held it to his jaw and sat with the cold and the faint throb of it, and thought about Victor Crane standing against the back wall of that staging room, watching Sienna with his patient, mild grandfather's face. He knew, eventually, toward the end. He chose to look elsewhere. There was a particular kind of person who built things like this. Not evil in the theatrical way, not angry, not violent by temperament, just willing. Willing to use the gaps between what was visible and what was true, willing to move the pieces while everyone looked at the board instead of the hands. Cole had encountered that kind of person in other contexts, other geographies. He'd never stopped finding them the most difficult thing to carry home from an operation, not because they were powerful, but because they were ordinary. You could pass them in a hallway 40 times and see nothing. You could receive their condolences at a memorial service. He didn't say any of this to Sienna. She was on the phone with her attorney, and it wasn't information she needed right now, and she was already carrying enough. He held the ice to his jaw and listened to her voice, precise and composed, already moving to the next thing, the Sunday meeting, the evidentiary package, the sequence of it, and thought that the person who had designed that network had badly miscalculated one thing. He thought that the direct approach, the parking garage, the hotel, the pressure, had been attempts to stop Sienna Ashcroft. They hadn't understood that pressure was what she ran on. Outside the hotel, Chicago was doing what Chicago did on a Saturday night in November, cold and lit and continuous, indifferent to the things that happened in its service corridors, the small, decisive moments that would only matter weeks or months later when the formal machinery had caught up to them. Cole had lived in this city for 2 years, and he still found that continuity strange, the way the city's ordinary life went on underneath and around the things that mattered. Sienna finished the call. She set the phone down. She looked at him across the conference table with the particular expression of a person at the end of a very long day who hasn't quite processed all of it yet. "My father's memorial service," she said. "Crane was there. He shook my hand." Cole said nothing. "I thanked him for coming," she said. The heat in the conference room was slightly too high, and the ice had mostly melted in the towel, and down the hall someone dropped something metal with a clang that echoed briefly and then was absorbed by the building's general quiet. "You didn't know," he said. "No." She looked at her hands on the table. "But I should have looked harder. You were running a company that was trying to survive a leadership transition while someone was quietly emptying its foundations," he said. "There's a limit to how hard anyone can look at everything at once." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you tell yourself? About the things you missed?" It was a fair question, and a harder one than it appeared. He sat with it for a moment. "Sometimes," he said, "when it's true." She nodded. Then she picked up her phone again because there were 3 more calls to make before Sunday morning, and she was the kind of person who made the calls. He sat across from her and waited, and the night continued around them. And somewhere across the city, Emma was asleep in her bed with the window cracked the way she liked it, even in November. And tomorrow was the day before everything changed, and Cole held the damp towel with the remnants of ice in it and thought about none of those things and all of them at once. The FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road had the particular institutional quality of a building that had absorbed 10,000 serious conversations and retained none of the emotional residue. Clean carpet, fluorescent light, the smell of recycled air and old coffee, a reception desk staffed by someone whose job was to be politely unhelpful until you were supposed to be helped. Sienna had been in rooms like this before, for other reasons, in other capacities. She had never been in one carrying what she was carrying now. Dana Chu met them in the lobby at 8:47 a.m. She was in a charcoal suit and looked like she'd slept 4 hours and decided that was sufficient. She shook Cole's hand, glanced briefly at the bruise along his jaw, and said nothing about it, which he appreciated. "A SAC Merrill is already in the conference room," she said. "He's read the preliminary summary I sent last night. He's not skeptical. He's cautious, which is better. Don't volunteer information outside what we've organized. Answer what's asked directly, then stop." "I know how to do that," Sienna said. "I know you do." Dana looked at her. "This is different from depositions in boardrooms. They're going to ask about your father." Sienna's expression didn't change. "I know." They went upstairs. A SAC Merrill was in his early 50s, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he kept forgetting were there and reaching for on the table. He had the organized, unimpressible quality of someone who'd worked financial crimes for 20 years and had seen the full range of human creativity in the design of fraud. He shook their hands, looked at the evidentiary package Dana slid across the table, and spent 12 minutes reading in silence before he said anything. What he said, when he said it, was, "Crane." "Yes," Sienna said. Merrill took his glasses off his forehead, which he'd finally remembered, and held them in one hand. "Victor Crane has been on our peripheral radar for 3 years. Different context. A defense contracting inquiry that went cold when 2 of our cooperating witnesses declined to continue cooperating. He said this without apparent emotion. We were never able to establish the connection to the witnesses' change of heart." "He pressured them," Cole said. Merrill looked at him. This was the first time he'd addressed Cole directly. "You're the one who built the analytical map." "Yes." "What's your background?" "Navy. 11 years. Merrill looked at him for a moment with the particular assessment of a federal agent evaluating a source. "The hotel last night," he said. "You were present." "I was." "CPD's report has you as a witness." "That's accurate." Merrill held his gaze for another moment, then looked back at the evidentiary package. "What we have here, combined with what we already have on file, is sufficient for a warrant," he said. "I want my forensic accounting team on the subsidiary records by end of day. The shell companies in Delaware are the priority. If Crane moves to liquidate those structures, we lose the financial trail." He looked at Dana. "I need a preservation order on all Halcyon records. Today." "I'll have it drafted within the hour," Dana said. "Crane himself." Merrill set his glasses down. "He was at the hotel last night. CPD has him. He hasn't been charged yet because the hotel incident is currently a misdemeanor-level matter, and I need to build to the federal charges before we touch him. If we pick him up too early, his attorneys will have him out before we've secured the documentation trail, and he'll spend the next 6 months moving assets." He looked at Sienna. "I need you to continue your normal schedule for the next 72 hours. Go to Halcyon, go to your meetings, behave as if Sunday morning didn't happen." "You want him to think he still has time," she said. "I want him to think that the hotel incident rattled you and that you're regrouping. Rattled people don't move fast. If he believes you're rattled, he'll wait." Merrill paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her with a brief, genuine assessment. "Your father's involvement," he said. "Crane told you last night that he knew?" The conference room was very quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "We may need to look at that." "I know." She said it cleanly, without hesitation, which cost her something visible only if you were watching carefully. Cole was watching carefully. "Whatever you need. My father died 14 months ago. If he made choices I don't agree with, that's a separate matter from the investigation." Merrill nodded slowly. "All right." He put his glasses back on his forehead. "Let's start from the beginning of the financial record." They were in the conference room for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Cole dropped Dana at her office and drove Sienna back toward the north side in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It had the texture of 2 people processing the same event from different positions, not needing to narrate it. He stopped at a light on Michigan Avenue, 2 blocks from where the Ashford Hotel sat behind its weekend quiet facade, and she looked at the building as they passed it. "My father," she said. "You don't have to. He built Halcyon from 11 employees and a regional trucking contract," she said. "He worked 6 days a week for 30 years. He wasn't a dishonest man. He wasn't." She paused. "But he was tired at the end. The last 2 years he was tired in a way that went past physical. And I think someone offered him a structure that looked like stability. And by the time he understood what it actually was, the cost of stopping it felt larger than the cost of looking elsewhere." Cole drove. The light changed. The city moved around them. "He left it for me to find," she said. "I've been thinking about that. Whether it was deliberate. He restructured the subsidiary audit process 6 months before he died. He was the one who moved it to the internal records channel that Preston Hale managed. He could have consolidated it into a division where it wouldn't have been visible." She looked at the street. "He left a thread he knew I'd pull." Cole thought about that. About a man at the end of his life making a quiet, deniable gesture that was the closest he could get to repair. "That's one way to read it," he said. "It's the way I need to read it," she said. "Right now." He didn't argue with that. Some readings were accurate because they were true. Others were accurate because they were the ones that let you keep functioning, and the distinction mattered less in the immediate term than people like to pretend. He parked in front of her building. She didn't get out immediately. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "Emma's birthday. You mentioned it's coming up." He looked at her. It wasn't what he'd expected her to say. "December 4th. What does she want?" "A sky cat," he said, "which is a cat that can fly. She drew it. She's been revising the design for 2 weeks." Sienna looked at him with an expression that was tired and genuine, and underneath both of those, something that had survived the last 18 hours intact. "I know someone who makes custom stuffed animals," she said. "A small shop in Wicker Park. Would that be—" "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't." She held his gaze. "Would it be all right?" He thought about Emma at the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, arms folded across her chest in her small person's posture of authority. "She can come to dinner sometime if she wants." "Yeah," he said. "She'd like that." Sienna nodded. She got out of the car and he watched her go into her building, and he sat there for a moment longer than was necessary before he pulled back into traffic. The 72 hours that followed were the kind of hours that felt, while they were happening, like the gears of something enormous turning too slowly to perceive and yet moving. Cole had been in waiting periods before, operational pauses where the mission was technically in progress, but the visible activity had stopped and you were simply existing in the space between the last thing and the next thing, trying not to let the waiting make you careless. He went back to work. His contract at Meridian Tower had been quietly suspended after the garage footage went public, the building management uncomfortable with the attention. But he had 2 other contracts, a mid-rise in Pilsen and a medical office building in Hyde Park. And he worked those through the week, checking systems and making the particular kind of small repairs that buildings accumulated the way people accumulated small grievances. Things that almost worked. Things that had been compensating for a long time and were tired of it. He talked to Merrill's office twice. Brief calls, updates that were mostly confirmations that Crane had not moved. The preservation orders were in place. The forensic accounting team had confirmed the Delaware shell structure within 6 hours of receiving the records. The warrant application was with a federal judge. On Tuesday evening, he picked Emma up from school, and she showed him a drawing she'd made that day. An elaborate revision of the sky cat, which now had a saddle and the ability to breathe colored smoke instead of fire, because, she explained, fire was too dangerous, and colored smoke was more useful for finding people who were lost. He held the drawing in the parking lot of her school and looked at it seriously, the way she required, and told her he thought the colored smoke was a significant improvement over the original design. "I know," she said, with the certainty of an artist who has solved a problem. They had pasta for dinner, the box kind with the powdered cheese that she preferred over the fresh kind he made from scratch, a preference he'd stopped arguing with because some battles reorganize themselves into non-battles if you let them sit long enough. He washed dishes while she did homework at the kitchen table. Second-grade homework, which involved a worksheet about subtraction and an instruction to draw a picture of something that made her feel happy, which she executed with a dispatch that suggested she'd already known the answer before she read the question. When he came to look over her shoulder, she'd drawn 3 figures, a small one, a taller one, and one in between, all holding hands. Stick figures with round heads, the way children drew figures when they were more interested in the relationship than the likeness. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to the middle figure. "That's Sienna," Emma said with the conversational ease of someone stating an obvious fact. He looked at the drawing for a moment. "Have you even met Sienna?" "No," Emma said. "But you talk about her." "I don't—" He stopped. Maybe he did. Not in any deliberate way. Not in a way he'd been conscious of, but Emma was 6 and had her mother's attention to the subtext of things, the way she could read a room by the quality of a silence rather than the content of speech. "I'll tell her you drew her," he said. Emma considered this. "Tell her I gave her good hair," she said. "I spent a lot of time on the hair." He looked at the drawing again. The middle figure did have a notably elaborate mane of scribbled lines, considerably more detailed than the other 2. "I'll tell her," he said. The warrant came through Wednesday afternoon. Merrill called Cole directly, which wasn't protocol, but was, Cole suspected, a courtesy extended to someone whose analytical work had been central to the case structure. "We're moving on Crane tonight," Merrill said. "I wanted you to know." "How's it going to go?" "He's at his residence in Lincoln Park. He hasn't gone anywhere in 4 days, which either means he's confident or he knows the window is closed and he's made his peace with it." A pause. "I've seen both. Hard to tell from the outside." "He's not the type to run," Cole said. He'd been thinking about Crane for 2 weeks, the architecture of how he thought. Running is loud. He'll wait and he'll fight through his attorneys. That's the structure he built. Legal deniability at every layer. He'll believe it holds. "It might hold at the edges," Merrill said. "It won't hold at the center." "No," Cole agreed. "It won't." He told Sienna by text 2 words, "Tonight, Crane." Her response took 3 minutes. She was probably in a meeting. And when it came, it was also 2 words, "I know, Merrill." He sat with the phone for a moment, then put it in his pocket and went back to the maintenance checklist he'd been working through in the Hyde Park building, because the job still needed to be done, and the building's HVAC system did not care about federal warrants. So, Victor Crane was arrested at 9:14 p.m. on a Wednesday in November at his Lincoln Park residence by 4 FBI agents who rang the doorbell with the particular courtesy that federal agents extended to 70-year-old men in expensive homes. He came to the door in a robe and looked at the warrant with reading glasses and said, "According to the agent's report, I'd like to call my attorney." He was cooperative, unhurried, and said nothing further without counsel present. Douglas Fenn was arrested 40 minutes later at his Gold Coast apartment, which went less smoothly. He'd been in the process of shredding documents, which added an obstruction charge to an already substantial list and clarified for the record that, whatever his outward composure, he'd understood the walls were closing. Preston Hale turned himself in at the federal building on Thursday morning with his attorney and a proffer agreement already drafted, which told Cole something about how long Hale had been waiting for this particular door to open. He cooperated fully. What he gave the investigators filled in several of the gaps in the upper structure that Cole's analysis had identified but hadn't been able to fully document. The direct communications between Crane and the municipal officials, the mechanism by which the fraudulent bids had been channeled through legitimate procurement processes, the 2 additional board members who had been aware and silent. The picture that emerged in the following days was substantially what Cole had mapped from Sienna's documents, with additions and corrections that refined rather than revised the core structure. 7 years of systematic fraud. Close to $900 million moved through Halcyon's subsidiary network. 14 municipal infrastructure projects across 6 states that had been built below specification. The Rockford water main, and 3 other cases of failed infrastructure that investigators were now linking to the underfunded contracts. Sienna read the full investigative summary in Dana Chu's office on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after the arrests, and sat with it for a long time without speaking. Dana gave her the space. She'd learned, Cole gathered from her account of the meeting, not to rush Sienna through things that needed to be sat with. What Sienna said eventually was, "We rebuild." The company, the contracts, Sienna said, the projects, the ones that were built wrong. We find out which ones, and we fix them. Halcyon's clean assets can fund a remediation program. If the legal structure won't allow it directly, we find a way through a foundation, through partnerships with the affected municipalities. She looked at Dana. People live near that water main. People use those bridges. That's the obligation. Dana looked at her with the expression of an attorney calculating both the legal complexity and the character of the person proposing it. That's an extraordinarily expensive commitment. "I know what it costs," Sienna said. "I know what it costs not to." She told Cole about it that Saturday, at his kitchen table again, over the coffee that had become its own kind of ritual without either of them deciding that. He listened to the remediation plan, the legal structure Dana was working out, the preliminary conversations with 2 of the affected municipalities. "That'll take years," he said. "Yes. And it won't be," he chose his words, "it won't be clean. Some of those municipalities will fight the terms. Some of the political figures involved in the original contracts are still in office. There'll be resistance." "I know." She wrapped both hands around the mug the way she'd done the first morning. I'm not doing it because it's clean. I'm doing it because the alternative is taking what's left of my father's company and running it like none of this happened, and I can't do that. He looked at her. Your father didn't build a corrupt company, he said. He built a real one that someone corrupted. There's a difference worth keeping. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the Bridgeport street was doing its Saturday morning things. The dog behind the fence, the grocery cart, the cars warming up, the ordinary machinery of a neighborhood that didn't know it was adjacent to anything significant. How are you doing? She asked. It came out a little abrupt, like she'd been holding it back and decided not to. I'm fine. You have a bruise on your jaw that's been there for a week. It's clearing up. Cole. He looked at her. I'm fine, he said again, with more precision this time. I'm not carrying anything heavy from this. The hotel was what it was. Crane was what he was. He paused. What I keep thinking about is the Rockford water main. She waited. The people who built that, he said, they weren't criminals. They were contractors trying to meet a bid price on a government contract that was going to be underpaid regardless, because the money was being siphoned before it got to them. They cut corners because the math didn't work and nobody was looking. And 2 winters later, a family's basement flooded and 3 blocks of pipe had to be dug up. He looked at his coffee. Nobody designed that outcome specifically. It just happened because the incentives were wrong at the top, and the consequences landed at the bottom where they always do. She was looking at him with a stillness that meant she was hearing something beyond what he'd said. That's why you agreed to help, she said. Not because of me. Not at first. Not only because of you, he said. No. She nodded slowly. The innocent employees, she said. That's what you told me at your door, that you agreed because the conspiracy threatened innocent people. I knew what it felt like, he said, to be the person at the bottom of a structure making decisions that didn't make sense to me, following a mission logic that somebody else designed, finding out afterward that the logic had a rot in it I couldn't have seen from where I was standing. He stopped. That's not a direct comparison. It's not the same, but the shape of it. She looked at him for a long moment. You've never talked about the Navy like that before. No. You don't have to now either. I know. He picked up his mug. It's just, this one reminded me of things. That's all. The kitchen was warm, the coffee good, the Saturday morning light coming through the window at the low angle it had in November. Finding the table and the 2 mugs and the notepad she'd stopped bringing because they were past the stage of taking notes. Emma told me to tell you something, he said. She looked at him with the shift in her expression, the particular softening that happened whenever Emma entered a conversation, which he'd noticed some time ago and had decided not to comment on. She drew a picture, he said. 3 people. She said to tell you she gave you good hair. She spent a lot of time on it. Sienna looked at the table for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in the way they'd been in the hotel conference room, and this time it was unambiguously tears, held back with the same discipline she applied to everything but present. I'd like to meet her, she said. She's asked about you, he said. More than once. What does she say? He considered how much to tell her. She wants to explain the Sky Cat to you directly, he said. She says I probably didn't explain it accurately. Sienna laughed. It was a real one, unheld, and it changed her face completely. Not into something unrecognizable, but into something less defended, the version of her that existed when nobody needed managing. She's probably right, Sienna said. You're very literal. I prefer precise. Of course you do. She picked up her coffee. When can I meet her? She has a thing at school next Friday, parents and family. Her teacher does a reading showcase. He paused. You don't have to... Cole, she said. Yeah. Stop giving me exits. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the same directness she'd had from the beginning, since the parking garage, since the kitchen table, since the diner in Pilsen. It was one of the things he'd had to recalibrate himself to. The directness, the willingness to say the actual thing and let it sit without packaging it. Friday, he said. 6:30. I'll be there, she said. The reading showcase was held in Emma's classroom, which had been decorated with the children's drawings and paper sculptures from the month's art unit. Parents stood in clusters while the children sat in a row of small chairs at the front, each holding a book they'd selected themselves and practiced reading aloud. Emma had chosen a book about animals that lived in unusual places, caves, deep ocean, inside other animals, and read it with the careful enunciation of someone who'd practiced but still couldn't quite get bioluminescent without a small hitch on the third syllable. Sienna stood beside Cole at the back of the classroom. She was in jeans and a coat, and she'd come directly from the office, where she'd been in meetings until 5, and she looked like someone who had made a deliberate effort to transition from one mode to another and had mostly succeeded. She'd texted him at 5:40. "On my way. Does Emma have a preference for flowers, or is that weird for a reading thing?" He'd written back, "Flowers are fine. She likes yellow." There had been a small bouquet of yellow flowers in her hand when she arrived. They stood about a foot apart and watched the row of second graders read, and Cole found himself noticing things with the particular clarity that sometimes arrived in ordinary moments. The way Emma's feet didn't quite reach the floor from the small chair, and she'd been swinging them during the other kids' readings, and had stopped when it was getting close to her turn, and had started again afterward. The way Sienna was watching Emma with an expression he hadn't seen her use for anything else, something open and unhurried and without any professional component at all. Emma spotted Sienna during the applause after a boy named Marcus finished his book about dinosaurs. Her face went through a sequence: recognition, recalibration of expectations, satisfaction, and she gave a small decisive nod, the way she did when a thing she'd predicted came true. After the reading, the children dispersed to their parents, and the teacher put out a table of juice boxes and small cookies, and Emma made a beeline toward them and stopped in front of Sienna with her small person's posture of authority and looked up at her. "You're Sienna," she said. "I am," Sienna said. "You're Emma. Your dad talks about you." Emma considered this. "What does he say?" "That you're the reason he gets up in the morning." Emma processed this with gravity. "He makes really bad pancakes," she said. "But I don't tell him." "Emma," Cole said. "It's true," Emma said without looking at him. She held out her hand with the yellow flowers Sienna was carrying and inspected them. "These are good. Did Dad tell you yellow?" "He did." "He's good at knowing things about me," Emma conceded. She finally looked up at Sienna's face with the full directness of a 6-year-old who has decided a person is worth assessing thoroughly. "Did he tell you about the sky cat?" "He did," Sienna said, "but he said you could explain it better than he did." This was evidently exactly the right thing to say. Emma's expression shifted into the focused enthusiasm she reserved for important subjects. "Okay," she said. "So here's the thing about the sky cat." Cole stepped back half a step and let them talk. A small thing, almost unconscious, but he felt it as deliberate. Sienna crouched down to Emma's eye level without being asked, holding the yellow flowers and listening with the full attention she brought to things that mattered. And Emma's hands moved through the air in the shapes of a cat that could fly and breathe colored smoke and find lost people. He looked at them, his daughter and this woman who had walked into a parking garage carrying evidence that changed everything, and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not happiness exactly, which he'd always found too simple a word for what it actually described, but something in the family of it. Something that had been away for a long time and had returned without announcement, which was, in his experience, how the important things generally arrived. He thought about Rachel, briefly, the way he did when something good happened, not with grief now, or not only with grief, but with the particular acknowledgement of carrying someone forward into the moments they didn't get to have. He thought about Emma, 2 years old and unknowing, while he was on the other side of the world. He thought about the 8 weeks between that phone call and the day he put in his papers, and how that decision had been the only clear thing in an otherwise incomprehensible period. He'd thought for a long time that the choice to leave had cost him something irreplaceable, not just the career, but some version of himself he'd known how to be. The person who moved through uncertain situations with a mission structure and a clear purpose, and the particular freedom of someone whose identity was fully contained in his function. What he'd gotten instead was Emma, and school events, and yellow flowers, and a kitchen table where people brought their real problems and sat with them honestly. He wasn't sure. Standing in the back of a second-grade classroom watching his daughter explain a fictional flying cat to a woman he'd met in a parking garage 6 weeks ago, that the trade was as complicated as he'd believed it to be. Emma grabbed Sienna's hand and pulled her toward the art display on the wall, pointing at something. Cole couldn't see what. some drawing she needed to explain. Sienna went willingly, holding the flowers in her other hand, and looked at whatever Emma was showing her with the expression of someone who found themselves, unexpectedly and without adequate preparation, exactly where they wanted to be. He got a juice box from the table and drank it, the small paper straw and the apple flavor that he'd bought hundreds of, and watched his daughter and Sienna move along the wall of drawings together, and the classroom hummed with the sound of parents and children and the ordinary mess of an ordinary evening that felt, tonight, like more than that. Outside the school windows, Chicago was doing its November thing, cold, lit, continuous. It didn't know what had happened in this city in the last 6 weeks, or what had been taken apart, and what was being built from it. It moved around all of it, indifferent and sustaining, the way cities did. Emma pointed at something else on the wall, and Sienna laughed, and the sound carried across the room cleanly. Cole finished the juice box and stood there, and didn't try to name what he was feeling, because some things named themselves eventually, and until they did, it was enough to simply let them be present. Winter arrived in Chicago the way it always did, not as an event, but as an accumulation, one cold morning layering onto the next until the city simply accepted that this was what it was now and adjusted accordingly. The lake went gray. The trees on South Carpenter Street lost their last leaves in a single overnight wind and didn't apologize for it. Emma started wearing the heavy coat she'd declared in October was unnecessary, without acknowledging that she'd changed her position, and Cole didn't press the point. The federal case moved with the methodical, unglamorous pace of serious prosecution. Victor Crane's attorneys were, as expected, formidable. 3 of them, from 2 different firms, filing motions with the relentless procedural fluency of people who'd been paid very well to make complexity work in their clients' favor. It didn't change the underlying architecture of the evidence, which was what Cole had built it to be. Layered, corroborated, resistant to the kind of edge-pulling that dismantled cases constructed on single threads. Merrill's team added to it steadily through November and into December, the cooperating witnesses filling gaps, the forensic accounting confirming the shell structure down to the transaction level. Douglas Fenn pleaded guilty in the 3rd week of November, which surprised no one who'd read his obstruction charge. The document shredding had been, in retrospect, the decision of a man who'd already calculated his odds and was trying to reduce them further, and the calculation had gone wrong in the particular way that panic decisions tended to go wrong. It made things worse while trying to make them better. His cooperation agreement named 4 additional individuals in the network, 2 of whom were municipal officials in different states who had been receiving quarterly payments through a consulting arrangement that appeared on paper to be entirely legitimate. Preston Hale's proffer produced something no one had anticipated, a series of handwritten notes kept in a personal ledger that Hale had stored at his home rather than his office, that documented his own involvement from the beginning, dates, instructions received, his own observations about what he was being asked to do and why he'd done it. He'd been keeping the ledger for 6 years. He'd started it, he told investigators, because he'd needed to put it somewhere outside himself, needed some place to acknowledge what was happening that wasn't just the interior of his own head. He hadn't intended it as evidence. He'd intended it as a kind of private accounting. When Sienna read the summary of the ledger's contents in Merrill's office in late November, she sat with it quietly for a long time. The ledger described a man who had known, from the beginning, that what he was participating in was wrong, and had participated anyway, and had documented his own wrongdoing with a meticulous honesty that he'd never extended to anyone who might have helped him stop it. He was keeping score, she said, not to anyone specifically. In a way, Merrill said, he could have come to me. At any point in 6 years he could have— She stopped, looked at the table. He was afraid. Yes. She was quiet for another moment. What happens to him? Merrill told her. The cooperation agreement reduced the charges. The sentence would likely be served partially or fully in a minimum security facility. There were conditions. It was better than it might have been, worse than nothing. His wife's still in remission, Sienna said. As far as I know, yes. She nodded and didn't say anything else about it. Cole, sitting across from her, watched her file it. Not away, not in the sense of dismissing it, but into the place where she kept the things that didn't resolve cleanly, the things that had weight and would continue to have weight and simply had to be carried. He'd come to understand over these months that this was one of her actual qualities. Not that she processed things quickly, but that she processed them honestly. She didn't tell herself convenient stories. When something was complicated, she let it be complicated and kept moving anyway, which was a different thing from pretending it wasn't complicated, and harder, and more useful. Halcyon Group's remediation program was announced publicly in December, 6 weeks after the arrests. Sienna had spent those 6 weeks in the architecture of it, the legal structure, the municipal partnerships, the financing mechanism that drew on the company's clean asset base, and a restructured board that now included 2 independent directors with infrastructure backgrounds and 1 representative from a municipal government association. The announcement was made not through a press release, but through a series of direct conversations with the affected municipalities, conducted by Sienna herself, over 3 weeks of travel to cities where the underfunded contracts had landed. She went to Rockford. She sat across a conference table from the city's public works director and 3 city council members and a representative from the neighborhood association of the block that had flooded, and she listened for 45 minutes before she said anything. What she said, when she said it, was not an apology structured around legal language or a commitment hedged with contingencies. She said what had happened, what Halcyon's role in it had been, what the remediation program proposed to do, and what it couldn't undo. She said the last part clearly, without softening it, because the people in that room had lived through the thing that couldn't be undone, and they deserved to have it acknowledged without decoration. The meeting lasted 3 hours. It did not end with handshakes and resolved expressions. It ended with the public works director saying he'd need to bring the proposal to the full council, and the neighborhood association representative saying she had questions she'd send in writing, and Sienna saying she'd answer all of them. It was the beginning of a process, not the conclusion of one, and she drove back to the airport in a rental car through the flat Illinois landscape in the fading December light and called Cole. "How'd it go?" he said when he picked up. "Hard," she said. "Necessary." "Yeah." The woman from the neighborhood association. Her name is Della Torres. Her family's been in that neighborhood for 40 years. She had photographs of the flooding on her phone. She showed them to me without saying anything. He waited. "I looked at every one," Sienna said. "I didn't look away." "Good," he said. "It didn't feel good." "No," he said. "It wouldn't." She drove through the flat Illinois landscape for a mile or 2 without speaking, the phone on the seat beside her on the speaker. "Emma wanted to know if I was coming to her birthday party," she said, shifting registers the way people did when they needed to move from one truth to another. "I told her I'd ask you." "December 4th, Sienna said. "I have a board meeting in the morning. I can move the afternoon." You don't have to move anything for Cole," she said, with the tone she used when she was declining an exit. "I want to be there." A pause. "Okay," he said. "She'll want you to know that the party theme is Sky Cats. She's been very clear about this." "I assumed," Sienna said, and there it was. The laugh, the real one, in a rental car on a gray December highway. And he heard it, and was glad she'd called. Emma's 7th birthday fell on a Saturday, which she declared was proof that the universe had good taste. A phrase she'd picked up from somewhere and deployed with authority she'd clearly decided it warranted. Cole made the pancakes, which were in fact not great. He'd never mastered the heat calibration. They came out slightly too thick and unevenly browned, but Emma ate 4 of them with maple syrup and the particular satisfaction of someone whose birthday had officially begun. The party was small. Cole had learned through the accumulated evidence of parenthood that Emma's preference was for intensity over scale. 4 close friends were better than 12 acquaintances, and the experience of really doing a thing mattered more to her than the performance of having done it. 4 second graders arrived at noon with their parents, who stayed for coffee and managed the organized chaos of children doing Skycat-themed activities that Emma had designed herself and explained to Cole the night before with the thoroughness of a project manager briefing a team. Sienna arrived at 2, after the games and before the cake, which was exactly when Cole had told her to arrive because the transition between activities was when an extra adult presence was most useful and least conspicuous. She came with a wrapped package and a sky cat made by the woman in Wicker Park, a stuffed creature with wings and an expression of great competence in blue and silver, which Emma unwrapped with a focus that momentarily silenced the room. Emma looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Sienna. "She got the wings right," Emma said. "The wings are right." "I described them very carefully," Sienna said. Emma held the stuffed animal against her chest with both arms and regarded Sienna with an expression that Cole recognized as the one she used when she'd reached a conclusion she was fully committed to. "You can sit next to me at cake," Emma said. It was, in Emma's economy, a significant offering. The cake was chocolate, made by a bakery 4 blocks away that had been Emma's choice, decorated with a blue and silver flying cat that bore a reasonable resemblance to the stuffed animal. Cole put 7 candles on it and lit them and stood back while everyone sang, and Emma squeezed her eyes shut and thought very hard about something she didn't share and blew every candle out with a single breath. "What did you wish for?" Caitlin asked. "You can't say," Emma said immediately, with the authority of someone who had strong opinions about procedural rules. Then she looked at the table for a moment and looked up and looked directly at Cole, and then at Sienna, and then back at the cake, and said nothing else. And Cole understood exactly what she'd wished for, and felt something move through him that settled into something else, quieter and more permanent. The other parents left by 4. Cole cleaned up while Emma showed Sienna her room, the drawings on the wall, the revised Sky Cat design portfolio, the rock collection she'd been building for 2 years and organized by a system of her own devising that she explained at length. Cole could hear their voices from the kitchen, Emma's high and precise, Sienna's lower, asking questions that were clearly the right questions because Emma's explanations grew more detailed and satisfied in response. He stood at the kitchen sink and washed cake plates, and outside the window the December afternoon was already giving way to the early dark that Chicago Decembers produced, the street light coming on at the corner, the neighbor's light in the upstairs window across the way. He thought about a parking garage in October, rain on the roof, 5 men and a woman with a flash drive, and the particular quality of her voice that had made him stop his cart and look up from his clipboard. He thought about the sound of her saying no when Fenn had extended his hand, flat and complete, without theater. He'd known something about her in that moment, something that the months since had confirmed and refined, that she was the kind of person who did the right thing, not because it was easy or because the cost was manageable, but because the alternative was being someone she couldn't live with. And that was the cleaner accounting, the one she could sustain. He'd learned things about himself in these months too, things he hadn't expected to learn at 35, which was when you were supposed to be done with the foundational discoveries and were just supposed to be executing the person you'd already become. He'd learned that the stillness he'd cultivated over 11 years, the operational stillness, the absence of reaction, had calcified somewhere along the way from a tool into a wall. He'd built it to protect function, and it had ended up protecting distance, which was a different thing entirely and less useful. Emma had been chipping at it for 4 years with the indifference to strategy that children brought to everything. Sienna had walked up to it and knocked, and he'd found himself opening the door in ways he hadn't anticipated and hadn't, in the end, regretted. That was something. He didn't have cleaner language for it than that. It was something real, and it was his, and he'd stopped waiting for it to resolve into certainty before he let himself acknowledge it. He dried his hands and went to Emma's doorway. They were sitting on the floor. Emma had the Sky Cat in her lap and was explaining the colored smoke system in detail, her hands moving through the air in the familiar shapes. Sienna was listening with her knees pulled up and her back against the bed frame, and she had the expression she got when she was genuinely engaged with something, the slightly forward quality, the attention that didn't wander. "Dad?" Emma said, without looking up, because she'd heard his footstep in the way that children knew their parents' approach. Sienna thinks the colored smoke should be different colors for different things, like blue for I'm lost and yellow for come here. That's a significant upgrade, Cole said. "I know, we're working on the system." Emma looked at Sienna. "What color for danger?" "Red," Sienna said immediately. "Red is always danger. You don't mess with the established conventions." Emma nodded with great seriousness. "Red for danger." "Okay." She made a note in the small notebook beside her, which she used for the Sky Cat design revisions, and Cole looked at the notebook and thought about how long she'd been keeping it, All the small, serious iterations of a thing that had started as a drawing and had become, in the way that children's ideas did, a real project with a logic and a history. He sat on the floor, too, because the floor was where the meeting was, and they sat in Emma's room in the early December dark and worked out the Skycat communication system with the focused attention it deserved. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep with the stuffed animal tucked under one arm and the notebook on her bedside table, Cole and Sienna sat at the kitchen table with the remainder of the coffee and the quiet of a house where a child had recently been celebrating and was now deeply, completely unconscious in the way that children slept after good days. "She's extraordinary," Sienna said. "She has her moments," he said. "She also argued with me for 20 minutes last week about whether socks were optional in November." "What was her position?" "That socks were a suggestion," Sienna smiled. She had her hands around the mug, the same posture as the first morning, and the kitchen looked the same as it had that morning too. Clean, small, the crayon drawing on the refrigerator replaced now with a newer one, a drawing Emma had made last month of the South Carpenter Street maple tree, which had impressed him with its attention to the specific angle of the branches. "Maddox Security Consulting," Sienna said. "Dana told me you filed the registration last week." "Yeah. How's that feeling?" He considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Premature," he said. "And right." She looked at him. "Both things." "Usually both things," he said. "With most decisions." She was quiet for a moment. "The first client inquiry came through the FBI referral?" "Merrill's Contact, a mid-sized logistics company in Indianapolis that's been dealing with internal fraud concerns. Not dissimilar in structure to what you had, but smaller, earlier stage." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I can actually help them. That's the part I keep testing, whether this is real or whether it's the version of the thing that looks real from the outside." "It's real," she said. "You mapped a $900 million network from a kitchen table and a printout." "I had good source material." "You had a mess of documents and 14 months of someone else's notes," she said. "What you brought was the pattern recognition. That's not nothing, Cole. That's not even close to nothing." He looked at her. She said things like this directly, without the careful hedging that people used when they weren't sure the recipient could handle a compliment without deflecting it. She said it and held it there and let it be received or not, which was a kind of respect that he'd noticed from the beginning and still wasn't fully used to. "Halcyon is doing well," he said. Not to deflect, because it was true, and he wanted to say it. "It's doing better," she said. "There's a difference. 2 board members resigned, 3 more are under investigation. The share price did what you'd expect. The remediation program costs are real." She looked at the table. "But the employees, the ones who had nothing to do with it, they're still there. Most of them. And the ones I've talked to, the ones in the divisions that were clean, there's something different in how they talk about the company. Like they're invested in the rebuild in a way they weren't before." "Because it's honest now," he said. "Because they know it's honest," she said. "That's the part I underestimated. People can feel the difference between working for something real and working for something performed. I thought culture was about programs and communications and leadership visibility. It is partly, but mostly it's about whether the thing at the center is true." He thought about this, about what it would have meant in the units he'd served in if the mission logic had been hollow at the center. How far it reached into the behavior of the people executing it, how it degraded the judgment and eventually the character of people who were otherwise genuinely capable. "Yeah," he said, "it reaches all the way down." She looked at him across the table, and the kitchen was warm, and the December dark pressed against the window, and Emma was asleep with her Skycat and her notebook of revisions. "I want to say something," Sienna said, "and I want to say it plainly, without managing it." He waited. "I've been careful," she said, "about this, about whatever this is. Careful in the way that people are careful when the last year of their life has involved a parking garage and a hotel service corridor and finding out that people they trusted had been lying for 7 years." She looked at him steadily. "And I think I've been careful in the right ways, for the right reasons. But I've also been careful in ways that are starting to cost more than they protect." He said nothing, because she wasn't finished. "Emma drew us holding hands," she said. "She drew it 2 months ago, before she'd ever met me, and she put it on her homework and called it a picture of something that made her happy. She paused. A 7-year-old has a clearer read on this than I've been letting myself have. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved against the window, and the streetlight at the corner held its steady orange, and somewhere in the building upstairs, the television was on. I'm not easy, he said. I don't do this smoothly. I go quiet when I should talk, and I talk about operational things when I should probably say other things, and I'm still working out which version of myself I am now that I'm not the person I used to be. I know, she said. Emma told you I make bad pancakes. She did. She's right. I know. The corner of her mouth moved. I don't need the pancakes to be good, Cole. He looked at her. He thought about the parking garage, and the kitchen table, and the diner in Pilsen, and the hotel conference room at midnight with the damp towel and the ice. He thought about all the small, unglamorous moments that had accumulated between that first night and this one, none of them dramatic, most of them involving cold coffee and printed spreadsheets and the steady, unglamorous work of understanding a complicated thing honestly. He reached across the table. She looked at his hand for a moment, not hesitating, just registering, and then put her hand in his, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen while the December night did what it did outside. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. But the trial of Victor Crane began in February and ran for 11 weeks. Cole testified for 2 days. Sienna testified for 4. The testimony was, on both sides, the technical and procedural account of what they knew and how they knew it. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the patient work of putting a true thing into a form that a jury of ordinary people could evaluate and judge. The jury deliberated for 9 days, which felt long and then didn't, and returned guilty verdicts on 23 of 26 counts. Crane sat in the courtroom and received the verdict with the composed, mild expression he'd apparently decided to wear throughout the proceedings, as if the thing happening were happening to someone else, at some remove from himself. His attorneys said they would appeal. They would, and the appeal would fail, and he would serve the greater part of a 12-year sentence in a federal facility outside Chicago. Douglas Fenn received 5 years under his plea agreement. 2 of the board members under investigation pleaded to lesser charges and received civil penalties and industry bars. The municipal officials in the other states were prosecuted by their respective U.S. attorneys' offices and received sentences ranging from 2 to 4 years. Preston Hale served 14 months and was released, and took a job with a nonprofit in the city, something modest and unrelated to finance, and as far as Sienna knew, he was doing it quietly and without drama, which seemed right. The Rockford water main was replaced the following spring, funded by the remediation program. Della Torres, the neighborhood association representative who had shown Sienna the flooding photographs without saying anything, sent her a brief note when the work was completed. It said, "It doesn't undo what happened, but it's something." Sienna kept the note in the drawer of her desk at Halcyon, where she put things she wanted to remember accurately. Yes. Emma's sky cat eventually had a name. She decided on it in March, after weeks of deliberation that she conducted with great seriousness, an occasional consultation with her father and with Sienna, who by March was at the South Carpenter apartment, often enough that her coat had a specific hook by the door that had become, without formal designation, hers. The name was Compass, because, Emma explained, a sky cat that found lost people needed a name that was about finding, and Compass was about finding, and also it sounded serious without being boring, which were her primary criteria. Cole was at the kitchen table when she announced this, going through the intake documents for the Indianapolis client. The work was expanding slowly, one careful referral at a time, which was the pace he'd decided was right, sustainable rather than fast. Sienna was on the couch reading a proposal she'd brought home from Halcyon, her feet tucked under her, the apartment's Saturday afternoon quiet around them. Emma stood in the kitchen doorway holding Compass by one wing and made her announcement. "Compass," Sienna said from the couch, without looking up from her proposal. "That's exactly right." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to her room. Cole looked over at Sienna. She turned a page of her proposal. "You knew she was going to announce it today?" he said. "She told me she'd made her decision. She wanted to wait for the right moment." "When did she tell you?" "Thursday, when I picked her up from school." He sat with this for a moment. The Thursday school pickup that had become, over the past several months, a thing that happened when Sienna's schedule allowed, and Emma had requested it often enough that it had acquired the weight of routine. The ease with which Emma had incorporated Sienna into the practical architecture of her week, with the unself-conscious logic of a child who decided what she needed and pursued it without apology. "She trusts you," he said. Sienna lowered the proposal slightly. "I know," she said. She said it with a gravity that told him she understood the weight of it, not as a charming fact, but as a real responsibility, the kind that didn't come with an exit. He looked at her on the couch, in the apartment that had been just his and Emma's for 4 years, and thought about something Emma had said to him a few weeks ago, in the offhand way she delivered her most significant observations, as if she were commenting on the weather. She'd said, "Dad, you seem less tired." He'd asked her what she meant. She'd shrugged and said, like, "less tired in your face." Then she'd asked for a snack and moved on, leaving him standing in the kitchen with that assessment, which he'd carried since. He didn't think he was a different person than he'd been. He thought he was closer to the same person he'd always been, the version that had gotten buried under the operational layers, and the grief and the long, careful work of being a single father with a history he didn't talk about. Not fixed. He wasn't interested in the idea of being fixed, which implied a prior broken state, rather than an ongoing, imperfect process of becoming someone adequate to his own life. Just less armored, present in a way that had more surface area. Emma came back through the kitchen, on her way to the refrigerator, holding compass. "Can we have pasta tonight?" she asked. "It's 3 in the afternoon," Cole said. "I'm planning ahead." "You can have pasta tonight." "With the good cheese, not the orange powder." "When have I ever used the orange powder when you asked for the good cheese?" She considered this seriously. "The time you were on the phone with the work stuff and you forgot." "That was one time." "It was a formative experience," she said, and got her snack from the refrigerator and went back to her room, and Cole heard Sienna trying not to laugh behind her proposal. "It was one time," he said. "I believe you," she said, in a voice that suggested she found the matter genuinely delightful. He turned back to his intake documents. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle it had in March, different from December, warmer by 1 gradation, a signal that the season was turning even if the temperature hadn't yet. Outside, the maple tree on South Carpenter Street was doing the first tentative thing that maple trees did in Chicago March. Not budding yet, but preparing, the branches holding something that wasn't yet visible. He looked at it for a moment. He'd spent 11 years learning to move through uncertain situations with maximum efficiency and minimum attachment, to complete objectives and leave clean, to care about outcomes without caring about the places. He'd been genuinely good at it. And then he'd come home to a 2-year-old who didn't care about efficiency and couldn't be left clean from, and he'd spent the 4 years since learning a different skill. The skill of staying, of being a consistent presence in a small life that needed consistency more than competence. What he hadn't expected was that the staying was itself a form of courage, not the visible 12-second kind. The other kind, the daily kind, the kind that didn't register on security cameras or produce 2 million view videos, the kind that was just showing up to the same life repeatedly and choosing it each time, even when it was hard, even when you were tired, even when the pancakes were bad. Emma was right. That was the formative experience. Sienna turned the last page of her proposal and set it on the cushion beside her and looked over at him, and he looked back at her, and the apartment held them both in its small, warm, ordinary way. And Compass the Sky Cat was somewhere in the bedroom finding the lost, and the pasta was hours away, and the maple tree outside was preparing for something new in the cold March light. He thought about all the things that had led here. The parking garage, the rain, a maintenance cart with one sticky wheel, a woman who said no when she should have said yes and meant every word of it. He thought about how many times the whole chain of events could have broken differently, how many smaller decisions had accumulated into this specific outcome, this kitchen, this afternoon, this life. He didn't believe the outcome had been inevitable. He didn't believe it had been deserved or earned or the product of some clean narrative logic. He believed it had been possible, and that possibility had been met with a series of imperfect choices made by imperfect people who were trying, in their separate and flawed ways, to do the right thing. That was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything.